Welcome to another episode of Conduct Detrimental. Dan Wallach, Dan Lust. We are back with another week of sports law. This episode, we're going to have on a guest, Mike Vorkunov. He was the basketball business reporter with The Athletic. We're going to talk a lot about Kyrie Irving, Ime Udoka, Josh Primo. But Dan, for you and I, we do have an NFL story in our midst. It is the story of the Indianapolis Colts' new interim head coach, which probably dovetails a little bit into the Brian Flores conversation. So a fun episode planned for today. Dan, nice job on the California sports betting episode. It's always fun to blend sports betting into the normal sports law beat. I'm sensing the feedback's been pretty good from our California sports betting episode.
Yeah, it was interesting. Sports betting has many intersections with conduct detrimental. I want to recount a story that occurred over the weekend. One of our listeners was on the campaign trail in Queens when a New York State Senator running for re-election, Toby Stavisky, and her son, Evan Stavisky, were campaigning. She's running for re-election, and they encountered one of our listeners who was wearing a conduct detrimental T-shirt out on the campaign trail in Queens County. Isn't that amazing?
You know what's funny? We, Dan, have not yet opened up the merchandise store to people at large. If you went to our New York City event, we handed out some shirts. We haven't opened up the store. Dan, do you think it's about that time that we should open up the store? Do you think that should happen?
Sure. If anybody wants to buy a T-shirt, for sure. Otherwise, they're going to wait until our next party a year from now.
No, we should.
To tie into sports betting with that campaign stop, Senator Stavisky's son is Evan Stavisky, who is the president, founder, and CEO of Parkside, a lobbying and governmental relations group. And his firm was very instrumental in representing DraftKings, FanDuel, the NBA, Major League Baseball. That firm was a powerhouse behind the scenes in Albany to get sports betting legalization, or at least online sports betting, passed a year ago. So it all comes full circle on conduct detrimental, sort of the two worlds colliding, sports law and sports betting on the campaign trail. So needless to say, I think our show has to give an endorsement to Senator Stavisky in her bid for re-election in District 16 in New York, which is one district over from Senator Joe Addabbo Jr., who sponsored or co-sponsored the online sports betting bill in New York. So, this is all, coming back, sports law, sports betting. And I think it was so hilarious that one of the principal movers and shakers behind the scene is related to somebody running for re-election, and they together encountered one of our listeners on the campaign trail wearing our, merchandise.
And does it shock you that people listen to the show, that we have friends in high places? It should not. It certainly should not.
No, the wearing of merchandise is what shocks me. There may be fewer than 100 people in the United States that are sporting conduct detrimental sweatshirts, and one of them happened to be on the campaign trail.
Dan, it shouldn't surprise you with the topics and the breadth of conversations that we cover that we'd have, again, people in high places and maybe people wearing the merch. Again, we'll open up the store at some point in time, but for now, if you come to our events, you'll get them, but at some point we'll open it up. Let's get into some business here. We're going to have Mike Vorkunov on the show, again, basketball business reporter with The Athletic. The main story that I wanted to talk with you about before we get to Mike, and then the back half of this, we'll talk some football. Dan, I don't know, full disclosure for anyone listening, Dan, you and I are both Jewish, so we tend not to cover political topics on the show and maybe third rail issues, but obviously this is a story now dealing with Kyrie Irving, and it's one that for interest of full disclosure, we thought we would mention it. From my vantage point, when Kyrie first posted this link to his Instagram story, I didn't make an assumption that Kyrie was anti-Semitic. I made maybe an assumption that he was reckless with his posting, and reckless in the sense that this film now on Amazon is a bestseller. Different iterations of this film in different, I think, languages are now like on the top 10 lists of various stuff. So reckless in terms of promoting a movie that I'm not sure Kyrie was endorsing in full or in part, but I thought the endorsement was somewhat reckless, but I didn't assume that Kyrie was anti-Semitic just from that. And then what happened since then, right? And obviously Kyrie wasn't suspended for the Instagram post. He was suspended in the aftermath. And that's where maybe I took some issue with some of the comments, right? Kyrie was asked initially at a press conference, about these comments. And he kind of spun it on the reporter. Why are you making a big deal of this? You just want to get famous on Instagram from asking these questions. So I thought that was a little combative, but that didn't didn't necessarily get raised to a level of me where I was, concerned about Kyrie's beliefs. And then he was asked point blank, again, after playing a couple games with the Nets, do you have anti-Semitic beliefs? That, to me, is, I think, a fair question. It's a softball. It's not slanted in any way, shape, or form. And Kyrie refused to answer no to that question. He said a lot of things. He said, if I know where I came from, I can't be anti-Semitic. He said a lot of maybe complexities in answering that question. So then you have to ask yourself one of two things, right? That seems to be a way that someone would respond to that question if they were anti-Semitic, by refusing to say no, or someone that's completely out of touch and doesn't understand that what's called for in that situation is a flat no. So I'm not sure which one it was, but at the end of the day, Josiah is the owner of the team. He had come out and spoken against Kyrie and saying, like, he's condemning these statements. Adam Silver, the commissioner of the league, spoke out against the statements. And you have to know that if those two people in the totem pole are speaking out against you and you refuse to apologize, something is going to happen to you, right? This is not it's a privilege to play in the league. It's not a right. And at that point, Dan, as a consumer of basketball goods, I wasn't sure, maybe it wasn't 50-50 to me, but it was some point between a 1% and the 99% chance that Kyrie was in fact anti-Semitic. And if I think that as a kind of a reasonable person, I think we went to law school, Dan, we're trained attorneys. Like, I'm not jumping to any conclusions. If I'm not sure, that's why I'm not surprised that Nike cut bait at a certain point and obviously suspended him. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off of it. But yeah, I wasn't, after two press conferences where Kyrie was not issuing his denial, at that point, then my antenna starts to go up.
Yeah, Dan, I think we could all agree that he had every opportunity after the initial statements to, walk them back. And the failure to walk them back magnified the issue beyond anything else. I mean, it's like our last guest on the Dan Snyder episode, I think, Trisha Thompson, said that they don't always get you on the initial offense. It's the cover-up or the lying about it. And in Kyrie Irving's case, it was not taking advantage of the opportunity, the freebie that he was being given to apologize and say, hey, this is not what I meant. But I think when we look at Kyrie Irving's career, he has a history, not of anti-Semitism, but contrarianism. I mean, this is the same player who was anti-vax and cost his team significantly all of last year, basically tanked the Brooklyn Nets season.
Flat earther on top of it.
Or they're at this flat. I mean, it's one thing after another. And I think Kyrie Irving, if nothing else, has shown himself to just sort of be just aggressively contrarianist. And he did that with his relationship with LeBron James. There's just something inside of Kyrie Irving that leads him to make these outlandish statements and then to double down, triple down, quadruple down on them. And while that might be, kind of funny in the context of Earth is flat, less funny with anti-vax, when you're talking about racism and targeting a particular ethnic, religious, or racial group, that's a line you can't cross in life or sports. And, whatever's happening to him is deserved. But unlike many other individuals in professional sports, like Donald Sterling, he's being given a get out of jail free card. Donald Sterling could not walk back his racist statement directed at NBA players in general when he didn't realize he was being recorded. There was no get out of jail free card for Donald Sterling. There is one for Kyrie Irving, and he's lucky. He's very fortunate that this is not going to cost him his career, but it raises larger questions about why the NBA was so dilatory in addressing this, nipping it in the bud when 8 years ago, in referencing the same Donald Sterling incident, the first act of Adam Silver's career as NBA commissioner was to immediately levy an NBA suspension, lifetime suspension. He acted quickly, expediently, no delay. Yet, by contrast here with respect to Kyrie, there was a week where there was nothing but crickets. And to this day, the NBA players, and we're going to address this with Mike Vorkunov, our guest today, the players by and large have not called out Kyrie Irving for his anti-Semitic statements, and it raises very troubling questions. Do the players believe it? Do the players not oppose some of the statements that were made by Kyrie Irving? Do they believe in some of the things and statements that were contained in that film? We don't know. Those questions have never been asked, but the continued silence of vast segments of the NBA player population raise these troubling questions. And it's up to Kyrie Irving to take remedial action now and put this issue to bed once and for all.
And Dan, just to expand on this point you made about contrarianism, which I think is right. Kyrie, in addition to not getting the vaccine last year, I think, maybe felt like he took a small win in that, right? That he didn't get the vaccine and he seemed to get some support for this. And I will say, Dan, I saw on Twitter, maybe a little troublesome, on Friday, a hashtag I stand with Kyrie was trending nationally. And I don't know what the right term is, but like what I want people to know, we're going to get into it with Mike a little bit, is that like, Dan, you and I might be Jewish, but I'm not speaking to, one view being different than another view. I'm just saying that you as an NBA player have to understand that if you make these contrarian, views, you could say, and he has different thoughts on the JFK assassination. He has different views he's put out on dinosaurs, whether they actually were what they think they are. He's got about 5 or 6 of these different conspiracy theories that he levies, but he's been in this kind of off the beaten path views, and he's been kind of doing that for his entire career. He's been a max NBA player for many, many years. And then I think he stepped over a line, and you don't really know where the line is until you go over it. So I think Kyrie kind of felt emboldened that he could have these kind of, non-traditional beliefs. His shoes were selling off the charts, but you make one false step as a professional athlete, it could all go in a split second. Kyrie's making, I think, $36 million this year. The Nets picked up his option on a 1-year deal, making $11 million from Nike. Nike has suspended their relationship. The Nets, I think, certainly are not going to re-sign him. And again, I'm not sure what team is going to sign up for this. So you make one false move, right? One wrong move in your path. And maybe Kyrie has made 3, 4, 5 moves. I'm not here to debate that. But you make one move, you cross that third rail, and that's it. Sometimes there's no coming back from it. So, yeah, I mean, it's a sports law issue because people should understand that the First Amendment does not give you the right to say whatever you want without fear of private ramifications. Kyrie might not have a job in the NBA next year. As crazy as that sounds, one of the most talented players in NBA history, he might not be employed next year by an NBA team. Teams have cut bait very quickly with, Dan, Stephon Marbury played in China for many years. He just got kicked out of the league for whatever reason. Colin Kaepernick was kicked out of the NFL for his own reasons, right? So now we're here. Yeah. I'm not sure Kyrie's going to be in the NBA next year. And that's such a crazy thought to have, but I think it's realistic.
Dan, I'm pretty sure he's going to be in the NBA because he will make amends. He will go through the 6 remedial steps that have been laid out by Nets general manager Sean Marks. He's not an idiot. He's not going to walk away from an 8-figure annual contract and kiss away his career. He will come back from this. He will be reinstated, and hopefully for his sake, this will be the end of the controversy. But I can't imagine any world in which Kyrie Irving, as talented as he is, at a position of great need and importance in the NBA, that he's not going to be part of the league because he will take the steps. He's not going to commit career suicide here and refuse to abide by these easy to satisfy conditions. They're not very challenging. It's basically apologize, meet with the team owner, contribute money to these organizations, and just take some basic steps of contrition. Not very difficult, and I think he will do that, and Kyrie Irving will be playing for the Nets or somebody else next year, and as long as he's still able to play at a high level, he's too good of a player, and this situation will eventually blow over.
I think we could both agree maybe he'll be in the league, maybe he won't be, but I don't think anyone's signing up for a max contract for Kyrie Irving, even though his stats seem to indicate he should be entitled to one. With all the different headaches that Kyrie has created, I don't think anybody is lining up for a max deal. But Dan, I think that's a good point to kick it over to Mike Vorkunov, the NBA business reporter. If anyone knows the answer to that question, certainly he will. He can line up for the 6 deliverables that Kyrie has to speak to, really how this might impact, truthfully, the comments or inaction or action on Kyrie's part might impact the next hiring of the Nets coach. It was going to be, I think, Ime Udoka, but maybe not anymore. And then obviously the Josh Primo story. So if people want to follow Mike, he is on Twitter at Mike Vorkunov. That is Vorkunov. And you can always check out his handle in our show notes. Without further ado, let us kick it over to Mike Vorkunov of The Athletic.
All right, everybody. It's NBA week on Conduct Detrimental. Joining Dan Lust and myself today is Mike Vorkunov, The Athletic's national NBA basketball business reporter and co-founder of the Twitter handle 30 newsletter. You're in the same business that we are. We try to hook up people for jobs in the industry. We have the ultimate job classified board for sports law jobs. You have something similar for journalism jobs. Welcome to Conduct Detrimental, Mike.
Thanks, guys, for having me. I appreciate it. I know we've been trying to make this work for a little bit, so I appreciate your patience.
We've got a lot to cover this week, Mike. A couple of big stories, 3 in particular, but we're going to lead off with Kyrie Irving. And by the way, you've picked a great year to transition from the Knicks beat side to the NBA business side. It's been no shortage of major stories, and I think Kyrie Irving is the tip of the iceberg. What can you tell us about his current status and where he stands with respect to meeting the 6 commandments? And can you go through what those commandments actually are?
Interesting choice of words there. As I think everyone knows by now, he was put on leave, suspended, whatever you want to call it, last week by the Nets. So he's currently absent for a minimum of 5 games from Brooklyn, and he has to fulfill 6 action items, as our Shams Sharani reported, and starting with issuing an apology for posting a link to the movie, completing anti-hate causes that the Nets and the ADL agreed upon with Kyrie in the joint release that they had last week. He has to complete sensitivity training created by the Nets. He has to complete anti-Semitic, anti-hate training designed by the Nets. He has to meet with representatives from the ADL as well as Jewish community leaders in Brooklyn. And then once he's done all that, he has to meet with Joe Tsai, who owns the Nets, and other franchise officials, and demonstrate that he's actually learned something from those 5 action items and everything that's gone on. It's only somehow been a week and a half that he tweeted a link to this exceptionally anti-Semitic movie that he shared on his Twitter.
Mike, if it was me, and I was given those 6 directives, I would have completed all 6 by now. And it's been, how long? It's been 4 or 5 days. Do you suspect that there may be any doubt as to whether he meets these benchmarks, or are these, in your view, easily achievable? And if he had if he was logical, these are obviously, each one of these are no-brainers. So where do you see this landing in terms of his compliance and the next steps in the relationship between the Nets and Kyrie Irving?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound glib, because I'm really not being that here, but it's hard to predict what will happen with Kyrie Irving, right? We've seen that continuously over the last few years. We've seen that over the last 2 weeks, where, as you said, any probably rational actor would have done certain things that Kyrie did not do. He had many chances, even before the suspension, to just simply say, when asked straight up, whether he was anti-Semitic, and he chose not to, right? And that's what kind of continued this whole thing to escalate and get to the point that it is now. He released an apology already on his Instagram, I believe, and that would, theoretically seem to mean that he's in compliance with point number 1 here. And so he has, issued an apology, and that's the first thing he did. Obviously there's the anti-hate causes that the Nets and he outlined, and including a $500,000 donation, which he agreed to. First of all, obviously that was before everything changed, right? You would think you would go through all this, but there's a minimum 5 games that he'll miss. We have to see where this goes as well. I don't know for sure, and this is something that would be up your alley as well, guys. Will the NBPA file a grievance for something like this, right? I don't remember the last time that a team suspended someone for tweeting about something and then not apologizing. This is kind of rare territory, basically, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but this hasn't happened off the top of my head while I've been covering the NBA. So you would think they would complete this as quickly as possible, but you can't say for certain. I think there's been some reporting, including our Sam Amick talking to NBA executives, wondering whether Kyrie will have a chance to return to the NBA. He's already had his relationship with Nike take a turn, right? And we've seen basically in his past, he's just been unwilling to say, I'm sorry, basically. And even the apology that he issued on Instagram, we now realize it was after the suspension. And we also now realize it was kind of a point of his return. So that kind of comes under different circumstances than it just an authentic apology would have come if he had just done it in the normal order of things.
The similar case in the NBA, if there is one, is maybe Myers Leonard from about a year ago. So for those that don't know, Myers Leonard was on a Twitch stream and said an anti-Semitic term. I think he was like a lottery pick back in 2012. So the time he makes this comment, he's 9 years in the league. He's averaging, 4 or 5 points a game. He's not averaging, a Kyrie level of all-star status. But Myers Leonard, I don't think ever plays in the NBA after that. I think that's probably a combination of making the comment and diminishing skill set. But I remember Myers Leonard had to go on the apology tour. He had to, speak with ownership. He had to do, some of the same, we'll say deliverables, however you want to phrase it. But to your point, maybe, again, if we're trying to figure out sports context, and Mike, you're in the business of this, right? Deshaun Jackson, not that long ago in NFL circles, made a similar comment, had to go through the same kind of, deliverables, going to meet with, I think he went to a Holocaust museum. So I think this is the most disturbing part from, us as lawyers, right? Lawyers are advisors, right? That's kind of what we do. We look back at precedent. I think Kyrie's team could have told Kyrie ahead of time that if you're not going to apologize, right, you are straying from whatever little precedent there is in our sports recent history. So I ask you, I don't know the answer to this question, but Kyrie played for, 2-3 games after making the comments. What was the impetus of suspending him? I don't know, like 3 games into this, right? It's not like he said anything worse, maybe the refusal to apologize? I mean, was it just that the Nets were trying to figure out how to act here, if they were trying to get around a grievance? I'm not sure here.
Well, I think it kind of ties up with what you mentioned originally, the precedents here, right? You mentioned like a Deshaun Jackson. We've had other athletes use, bigoted words before publicly or being caught for it publicly, right? But at least in that case, repentance or forced repentance, I'm not here to judge someone how true they are to their words, but came quickly, right? And that kind of at least cut everything off. He did play 3 games after his tweet. And what happened was, Sean Marks had his press conference after the second game, before the third game, after firing Steve Nash. And he basically said something to the effect of, okay, we're going to keep him out of the media, talk to him a little bit more, make sure he doesn't start another fuss, and hope that the next time he does this, basically, he'll be able to say, some version of I'm sorry or whatever ameliorative words that they hoped could calm the situation down. And it was Kyrie just not willing to back down, right? The public has given, a lot of ground to people who say and do bad things to eventually explain themselves away and offer some kind of apology and get back to normal. He just wouldn't even do that basic thing, right? Again, if you remember the press conference, I think it was Thursday, he was asked straight up, are you anti-Semitic? He's asked straight up, do you support the things in the movie, right? He didn't give an answer. He didn't give a clear answer. He didn't give an answer that would disassociate himself from all of that. And I think when you say like this is hazy ground, that's why, that's why I think he was ultimately suspended. It was not only his inability to take ownership and to disassociate with all the things in that movie and just a basic thing of just saying, no, I'm not anti-Semitic, guys. This was a mistake. It was also clear that he was not in accordance with what the Nets wanted him to do, right? So that also becomes a workplace issue with kind of you not listening to your bosses. I don't know if you'd consider them his bosses when you're talking about Josiah and Sean Marks. That's a separate story, but all these things kind of come together into one. And I think that's why this has become what it is.
As for your point about a grievance, I mean, the standard player contract is always going to have some form of a morals clause. And then separately, if your employer tells you to do X and you refuse to do X, and then I think reportedly not responding to the owner's text messages and kind of blowing them off, it goes from maybe what we could call a First Amendment issue to just really an employment issue. If you're kind of not listening to your employer who's asking you to do something that's apparently not being done for any type of discriminatory purpose, then it just becomes an employment issue. So for grievance purposes, and I think it's kind of rendered moot at this point because Kyrie has apologized. If he didn't want to apologize, maybe it would be a little bit different. But I think it speaks to kind of a general misunderstanding by the public of the implication of the First Amendment, right? The First Amendment allows you to say and do certain things without going to prison, right? Like Kyrie's not in prison. Kanye's not in prison, like Myers Leonard didn't go to prison, Deshaun Jackson, Riley Cooper. You can go through the list of people that have said bad things. Like no one's going to jail. You have the First Amendment right to say certain things, but the First Amendment doesn't protect you from private employers, right? So if the Nets and you have a morals clause want to suspend you, you can't like wave up, hey, I thought I had the First Amendment. I thought this was a free country. I thought we could say whatever we want. You can to a certain extent, but you're going to feel it in your wallet. And that's why I don't really think there's much of a grievance here.
I'm sure you guys could do an entire year-long series of podcasts on what ignorance of free speech meaning.
The law in general. That's usually what we're here for.
That's why I'm interested. It's also not only the grievance from can he, should he, will he. It's also does the NBPA want to get involved with that and have the bandwidth for it. Isn't
Kyrie on the board? Isn't Kyrie like
he's a VP? Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you saw, on The Athletic yesterday, 2 of our beat writers for the Celtics and for the Pelicans, who happen to have a number of board members between them, including the president, CJ McCollum, it doesn't seem like the board is really trying to cast themselves far away from Kyrie, right? Like they gave him a lot of movement there to basically find himself in its good graces, right? So I'm curious to see where all this goes, right? There's the question of how soon he'll come back. There's the question of what steps he'll take. There's a question of whether the NBPA will have a landing spot for him when he returns. And he still has to meet with Adam Silver as well. And so this is it's blown up into a huge issue that I think makes it a lot more uncertain than it originally looked like it would be.
All right, I want to turn to a theme of silence. Nothing at times is more expressive than silence, which is a quote from George Eliot. 2 silent actors in particular, NBA Commissioner Adam Silver, and then by and large, the NBA players. And I want to draw some parallels here to the Donald Sterling racism incident of 2014. When Donald Sterling was captured on a recording, he was recorded illegally making a disparaging comment about his girlfriend bringing a black person or a person of color to a game. That immediately led to a lifetime banishment. Adam Silver, in his first act of leadership as the newly installed NBA commissioner, imposed a lifetime suspension. He acted immediately without any delay. And Chris Paul and other players began to say, well, we're not going to play. We're not going to show up. They immediately protested this act, this blatant act of racism. Why is anti-Semitism now being treated somewhat differently by Adam Silver through his silence? And, I don't know if this is entirely accurate, but the players, with the exception of LeBron James, haven't exactly been forthcoming with their reaction and their rejection of these principles. And you can contrast that with how some of the Boston Bruin players recently reacted to the idea that the Bruins were going to sign somebody who bullied a black, disabled person in his youth. So what can you add? What kind of insight can you provide as to Adam Silver's silence and the collective silence of most of the NBA players in the face of what is clearly anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I think the silence of the NBA players the last week or so has been deafening to some degree. You mentioned LeBron, even him, it took a week for him to say something, right? LeBron has a very large microphone and a number of different channels to speak if he wants to. And it took him a long time to get there as well. And, it's been interesting to see because as you've seen, the NBA has been very quick to speak up about social justice issues, and rightfully so, right? But we've seen also over the last few months, I would say maybe even the last year, the NBA, the league office in particular, has tried to walk a line when it comes to things in their actual purview. We saw it with the Robert Sarver suspension, right? I would think that of all the things that happened, that their own report found to have happened, there was enough cause to try to take the team away from him, as Adam Silver tried to do in 2014 with Donald Sterling, right? They have spoken about the need to not leave Utah for the All-Star game after a bunch of transphobic laws were passed in the Utah Senate and legislature, right? And say they don't want to basically hop from place to place for its All-Star games now, right? Which is a step back from what they did in 2017 with North Carolina and the All-Star game there. So we've seen them kind of try to walk this line and basically not be as definitive as they were in the past. So we see it from the league office, we see it from the players. And in this case, it is really kind of baffling because this is also, an anti-hate speech issue. This is also an opportunity for people to go out and say something that is basic, which is we don't like bigotry in any kind, right? We don't want it seen from people in our, in our union, amongst our cohorts, amongst, players, if you're Adam Silver, and they just haven't been doing that. And the NBAPA put out a statement saying we don't condone, anti-Semitism and hate speech and all that, but refuse to name Kyrie Irving.
Yeah, they didn't even name him. So the NBA is quick to react to Daryl Morey, levying criticism of China, racist statements. Does this have the potential to bubble over and create significant harm with the league and its relationships with its fans? If, for example, Irving, escalates the situation, or there are just unanticipated consequences. I mean, this is really this is almost like a point of no return. If you're going to say negative things or anti-Semitic statements and not clamp down on it, I think the silence from the players has been somewhat disappointing to me. Do you see there being a larger issue concerning the league's relationship with its fan base if this isn't settled appropriately?
I don't know, honestly. I think fans have shown, whether it be for players, for teams in the past, to be able to show forgiveness, right, so to speak, to keep watching, to keep following, to keep rooting, to keep spending their dollars. I don't know that basically, what do? You give up on watching an entire league? As you said earlier, not really any players have come out full-throatedly against Kyrie Irving. If you read the story of even the executive board for the NBAPA, there was kind of the standard, we don't stand for hate speech, we don't stand for anti-Semitism, we think Kyrie messed up, and let's let the process play out. There hasn't been anything strong and definitive kind of rebuking him, right? Which makes me think that nothing is coming. And if an entire league, for the most part, is silent about it, can you really say that there's a lot of people taking issue with this? Do I think fans will give up on the league? I don't think so. I don't know how many people care, right? For lack of a better word, right? We haven't seen ratings fall over the last week and a half. We haven't seen any tangible ways to point to some kind of decreased interest or pain for the league coming as a account of this.
So I guess, we'll obviously keep tracking. We'll see what happens when Kyrie comes back. There's a topic that we talk about sometimes in the show called the Streisand effect, which is probably pretty well known in media circles. But, for better or for worse, obviously this brought a lot of attention to the issue. Kyrie's inability to apologize, I think, put even more pressure on him. So we'll see what happens when they come back. I know in our circles, Dan and I are both professors of sports law. I know my students at least were surprised that 5 games was a pretty arbitrary number, but we'll see. I think in the middle of all of this, and kind of leading to our next round that we wanted to cover with you, the Nets have put up an open position for a new PR person. So coincidental timing, right? And in the middle of all of this, right, we hear all this stuff with Kyrie, which I think people can agree the PR has been kind of handled slipshotty, maybe because they didn't have someone there. But reports surfaced last week that obviously in the wake of the firing of Steve Nash, they need a new coach. And that Ime Udoka, yes, the same Ime Udoka, who's currently in the middle of a 1-year suspension from the Boston Celtics from some unknown consensual relationship / it wasn't consensual / it was inappropriate. We don't know what happened, but we can all agree, undisputed, he's mid-suspension with the Celtics. So, Mike, what are you hearing on that front? Is Ime still the leader in the clubhouse, or the Nets soured on this? I have no idea what the latest is.
Yeah, it's been a week since almost simultaneous reports of Steve Nash is fired or mutually parted ways, as everyone likes to say now. And Ime Udoka seemed to be the next hire for the Nets, right? We had that by both Adrian Wojnarowski of ESPN, Shams Charania for The Athletic for where I work. And when something like that gets reported, it usually means it's pretty done. Sean Marks said at the press conference that same afternoon that they hadn't made their choice. But again, it seemed kind of hard to believe, right? He said there would be a due diligence. And so maybe part of this is the Nets stringing it out to make it seem like there has been a credible amount of investigation by them, right? To look into everything that's happened to him. But as I wrote and I said at the time, like, can the Nets do a better investigation than the Celtics did, right? In their own organization with all the resources that they had? It's hard to think that they can. And I think it was Mark Stein who reported that there's some people trying to talk Joe Tsai out of hiring Ime Udoka, but it certainly is curious now that it's been a week. There hasn't been anything since. You always do wonder, especially as this Kyrie Irving situation has escalated and gotten far more out of hand than where it had been last Tuesday, if anything comes in to kind of get in the way and see if the Nets maybe decide the PR hit, the reputational hit isn't worth it for them. But whenever something goes on this long, when it's been reported to have finished, I does kind of raise a few alarms at least.
The Nets keep coming up in these stories. I feel as if, the Nets have been a cursed franchise since Roy Bowe sold Julius Irving in 1976 to the Philadelphia 76ers for the sum of $3 million. And with the exception of the Jason Kidd era, the Nets have been seemingly, having a history of striking these Faustian bargains where, it's not just Kyrie and giving Kevin Durant control over who gets to be the general manager or coach. But this goes back to Kevin Garnett, Paul Pierce, going all in. What does this say about the ethos of the Nets organization? Can you draw is there a connective tissue going all the way back to the time they've been in Brooklyn? They seem awfully desperate to break the 47 or 45-year schneid of never having won an NBA championship, which, by the way, doesn't go as far back as the New York Knicks' own title drought.
Yeah, I mean, part of that is, there's that obviously to win its championship, but they're also still trying to establish themselves in New York and in Brooklyn, right? Like and I talk about, like you're at Nets games, you're at Knicks games, and you talk about this with people in and out of like the state, people around the NBA. Like the Knicks are New York City's basketball team. The Nets have they put a dent into that. They have good sales numbers for their tickets and all that. The Nets are more of a national team still, right? There are Kyrie and KD fans and people who are interested in them. But interest in New York and the Nets is much lower than it is in the Knicks. And so they're still trying to get a foothold in the city, right? We see now that Joe Tsai is probably the only NBA team owner losing money with how much money he's invested into the team. So there's a financial imperative to win a championship and try to maximize this window. And Sean Marks said something as much to that effect at his press conference last Tuesday, which is, why they fired Nash, why they would hire whoever they hire. They have to maximize this window with KD, with Kyrie, with the cap situation that they have now, because if they don't, it's only going to get worse. It's almost inarguable. KD will get older, or he'll request another trade. Kyrie will be a free agent. They don't have many pathways to getting better as a team. So this is kind of where they're boxed in to try to make the most of it. And when you make moves out of desperation, right, usually it's not completely rational ones, and that's what gets you in trouble.
I'm sure Steve Kerr is saying there, but for the grace of God, go I, because, you look at Nash and Kerr's trajectory. I mean, Kerr could have gone to the New York Knicks and gone to work for Phil Jackson, and he would have ended up in the same situation, fired after 2 years. Steve Nash could have gone to Golden State and won a bunch of championships. So there's almost like an element of luck or fate or, just timing surrounding the success or failure of a particular head coach. And I think it's unfair that Steve Nash bears the brunt of this debacle, none of which was of his own making.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been funny. I mean, honestly, if Steve Kerr goes to coach the Knicks, he's probably back on TNT like 2-3 years later. That's probably how it goes. Washed out with Phil Jackson when James Dolan fired him. Yeah, Steve Nash was just, there, wrong place, wrong time. I don't think he was a particularly good coach, right? It's not as if, oh my God, I can't believe they fired Steve Nash. But sometimes you take the wrong job, you listen to friends, you want to work with them, and this is how it all ends up. And, that's kind of what the Nets did as well, right? They so desperately wanted Kevin Durant and still want to keep Kevin Durant that they're allowing and making excuses for Kyrie Irving as they have in the last few years. Like, this isn't the first time that they're in this situation. Remember last year, Kyrie played 27 games, I think, because he refused to get vaccinated to follow with city rules, right? So he only played road games. And the year before that, he took a 2-week sabbatical mid-season pretty much.
Okay, before we leave this topic, I have one quick follow-up on Kevin Durant. I mean, if this season continues to go sideways, and I think the last couple of games, Durant has helped the Nets right the ship a little bit. But if this is heading towards the path of a non-playoff season, do you think Kevin Durant is going to force his way off the team and he'll be traded? And if so, do you think the Nets would entertain that?
I would put it like this, and because I've been thinking about this, I don't know that Sean Marks can trade Kevin Durant, because to do that, you're basically admitting a huge error and you're dissolving all that you've worked the last 6 years to create. And you probably aren't going to last in the job much longer anyway. So I think there's he can't take the sunk cost approach and rebuild, right? He understands that if KD goes, he probably goes too. And all of these decisions are obviously also psychological as much as they are basketball decisions. So I think it would probably take a new GM to trade away Kevin Durant and kind of restart this whole thing from scratch. And I wouldn't be surprised if it happens, because if Kyrie's gone, as he will be next June, unless somehow the Nets decide after all of this to bring him back, Kevin Durant doesn't have his best friend there anymore. And he came to Brooklyn in large part because Kyrie Irving was going to be there. These are guys who have a real affection to each other. I still said with me after their game 3 loss against the Celtics in the playoffs last year, as they crossed paths with each other, coming on and off the press conference podium, they said to each other, I love you. Like, how often does that happen amongst NBA players out in the public? So they have a real affection for each other. And if Kyrie's gone, what's keeping KD in Brooklyn anymore, right? And if they're going to trade KD, you might as well start all over. And I think that's basically how the Nets reboot this thing.
The answer about KD is probably the same reason, just to close the loop on Kyrie, is why Kyrie was not cut from the team. I think, if anybody says something along those same lines that Kyrie did about any type of class or any type of group, you're not getting a 5-day suspension from work. You're probably going to get cut from work. So, and I think that's maybe some fair blowback on the Nets organization that, like, why did Kyrie play for 3 games? Why is he only being suspended for 5? Like, is winning being taken into account? And then, right, if you cut Kyrie, KD is going to, obviously be upset from that. But, moving on to a player that obviously does not have as many ties into his organization, Josh Primo, the former 12th overall pick in the 2021 NBA draft. Mike, we spent a lot of time covering the Deshaun Watson saga in NFL circles, and we found out, which we can talk about, Josh Primo and the allegations. But the accuser in that, in this new case, Hillary Cawthon, is represented by the same attorney that sued Deshaun Watson. His name is Tony Busby. And this is a case of indecent exposure beginning in December of 2021, I think continuing into January of 2022 on reported 9 occasions. The lawsuit essentially claims that the Spurs did nothing despite being told. And here we are. We have another, NBA lawsuit on our hands. Obviously, the Spurs have cut bait. We can talk about maybe the legal strategy about cutting bait with someone. But Mike, what are you hearing in NBA circles about this case? I'm not really sure there is any precedent for this.
There's not that I can think of. The Bexar County Sheriff's Office has opened its criminal investigation into Josh Primo. Obviously, the lawsuit has been filed in Bexar County as well in Texas. So he's going to have to defend himself at the very minimum against the civil suit, right? And then we'll see what the investigation, the criminal investigation finds, if they decide to go and press charges eventually, or if they don't. We don't know that yet. But he got cut a year and a half after getting drafted as a lottery pick. The Spurs have obviously been very committed to him up until that point. And once they saw all the allegations of what was heading down the road, they decided that, they had to release him. And I don't know what's going to happen, because Greg Popovich won't even talk about it, citing the legal manners and all this. And I doubt any team will want to get involved until all the legal stuff is settled, just like with Deshaun Watson. No trade happened, right? Until all the different counties in Texas, right, dropped the criminal charges, if I remember correctly. Wasn't the timing weird?
There was one grand jury that cleared him, but there was a second grand jury that had yet to convene. And the trade occurred in between those two, which was an insane gamble, unless you have some inside information that the grand jury is, going to help you out. But yeah, I mean, what's interesting, I guess, from our standpoint, I guess there's probably two things. Number one, right, the Spurs cut bait with him, whatever that Thursday was. So they cut him, and Primo issues a statement that says, essentially, I'm dealing with a prior trauma. I'm going through mental health. Please respect my privacy at this time. Absent from that statement is any sort of denial in any shape of way or form of what has transpired. So that certainly, I think piqued everyone's attention. And I listened to the Round of Basketball podcast, non-lawyers that week that said, I don't know, there's no denial in here. So I guess that's why the Spurs cut him. And then, 4 days later, you have this press conference last week with Tony Busby and Hillary Cawthon. And then all of a sudden you have a denial from Primo. It says, maybe this was incidental. No one's ever told him, and all these different sessions. This is a 40-year-old woman, and no one has ever told him about this. And obviously he didn't intend to do this. So I think, Mike, you're right. Like if I had, my class over the weekend, I asked my students to show hands. If you're running an NBA team, would you sign Kyrie Irving right now? And like some of them sheepishly raised their hands. And I think they felt bad about doing it. In terms of name recognition, in terms of talent, Josh Primo is nowhere near the same level. And then you start getting close, even though, right, everyone is innocent until proven guilty. We go over to our NFL circles, a guy by the name of Matt Ariza, a punter that the Bills had, a fourth-round pick. Allegations? I don't know. Guy's a punter. You can cut a punter. There's punters are a dime a dozen. Seems like we're there with Primo, right? If the allegations are that bad and you don't have an established star on the other end, you might not get back to the league anytime soon. Is that kind of what you're sensing on that front?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, this all becomes kind of a risk moderation, right? Unfortunately, that's how some teams view this and Josh Primo is not established enough to be worth it at this point. Unfortunately, I think that's what teams view it as, right? You wish they would kind of take basically a different approach that's much more moralistic, but that's not what happens, unfortunately. And yeah, I would be surprised if Josh Primo finds himself on an NBA team in the near future, just because teams are going to want to see what the legal process plays out, how the criminal process plays out, and what becomes of that. And even then, I think there might be squeamishness, even if things all play out in Josh Primo's favor. But the allegations made by the former Spurs psychologist, they're pretty strong, right? They're pretty sensational. And they seem fact oriented, which I only had 1 year of law school, but it seems like a clear thing is stating facts in your complaint, right? Making sure that's how you pass the point of not having the judge throw it out.
You should have led with that, Mike, that you had 1 year of law school.
It's 1 year. That's the problem.
You got it right, though. At least you remember enough from cil procedure to be dangerous. So, credit to you on remembering your lessons from law school.
Just quick. I mean, the other point here that I find fascinating is that, this is a pretty factual statement. There's dates, and I think all of that's pretty important in terms of assessing credibility. In addition, right, Primo's lack of denial on day one, and then all of a sudden he decides to deny it on day 5. Interesting. The other part, which I, wanted to get your assessment on, Mike, the San Antonio Spurs, after cutting Josh Primo, okay, they cut the guy, they don't stand by him. They issue a denial of sorts and a rejection of Hillary Cawthon's statement of events. They say they disagree with the timeline, disagree with a lot of things. From at least my vantage point, it's hard for the Spurs to deny Cawthon's allegations when they had just, right, a week ago fired Primo. So are you getting into indication of what the Spurs agree with, what they don't agree with, right? I'm not sure where that line is. I find that part to be very interesting.
As I've been following this a little bit, there's been a few things that I found interesting. That, as you said, is if you're going to cut him, you're saying there's some kind of wrongdoing going on, right? And then to have a blanket denial doesn't make sense with that. Additionally, as you said with Josh Primo and what he said, there's also the statement too from his lawyer, and you guys can tell me if I'm reading into it the right way, William J. Briggs II, who in that second paragraph of the statement said that he never intentionally exposed himself, but it wasn't a blanket denial that he never exposed himself, which leads to more questions, right, about what went on there. And I think the whole thing is basically a little cloudy right now because there's even the involvement of Greg Popovich, right? I believe the lawsuit said that at some point Spurs officials told Greg Popovich that he might have known. And then later on, I believe it was Tony Busby who came out himself. We don't know for sure if he knew, right? He came out and almost contradicted himself. And so I think there's a lot more to be understood about what's going on there because there are kind of contradictory things coming from all parties right now.
Yeah, what's confusing to me about the sort of the patient-doctor relationship here? You have a player, Josh Primo, who's visiting a team psychologist wearing his basketball attire, he's wearing shorts. He's in a situation where there could be a potential for misunderstanding, which may have been what happened here. Shouldn't there be a rule or some kind of, mandate coming from the league or the team that when you see a doctor, when you see a psychologist, dentist, anybody, you wear casual clothing, normal clothing, long pants, and then this problem wouldn't have arisen? Isn't this somewhat out of character to have players coming in uniform or practice gear speaking to their sports psychologists? I know that attire is probably very convenient because they're going from the court to speaking to the psychologist, but couldn't something like this easily be cured going forward by not having these types of misunderstandings and just having some kind of a clothing requirement?
Well, I mean, it is workplace attire, right, for the NBA, for basketball, for sports. And additionally, I don't think that the NBA can go so far, right, to kind of legislate what people wear. They even remember they tried to do that. I think it was almost 2 decades ago now. David Stern tried to say what you can wear on the bench when you're not playing. So I assume like that would have to be almost contractually bargained. And I don't know if the players union would want to go so far as to allow kind of like language in there about what you wear to therapy sessions. I understand how it could lead to, if there is potential disagreement, I understand about maybe how it's perceived in this particular instance, but I don't know if you can just go out and say like, hey, you have to wear pants to a session of some sort.
Not exactly an unreasonable requirement, but let's focus on the larger, broader, and unspoken of legal issue. Let's talk about the Spurs legal culpability, because Tony Busby filed suit only against the player, but not the team. And your article in The Athletic lays out a chronology of events in which the psychologist, Dr. Cawthon or Ms. Cawthon, made complaints to the team on a number of occasions. And the team either failed to take meaningful action, had the psychologist allegedly work remotely, and took no independent action to kind of separate the player and the team, or the player and the psychologist, or have a sort of a talking to with the player. So what are you hearing about the team's responses to her initial complaints, and what remedial steps, if any, were taken?
Well, I believe the Spurs were also sued in that lawsuit. If I'm looking at the Bexar County case information right now, they're listed as a defendant along with Josh Primo. So I think that they'll have to answer for their actions as well, or inactions, whatever the case may be.
I guess the point I'm trying to make overall is that there was some kind of a notification here and multiple encounters between the player and the psychologist. Why did they continue to meet over a multi-month period if there was a problem identified at the outset that required or called for some kind of an intervention, or maybe referring the player to a different professional?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be a crux of the lawsuit too, right? It seems like, based on what Dr. Cawthon was saying in her suit, was like, why did this continue to happen? She made, I think, multiple statements to Spurs people to notify them that this was going on. And she says that they continued to let these meetings happen and try to, it seems like, mediate the situation instead of, as you said, direct him to another therapist or try to step in and do something. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes out and to see the chronology of things, because, as I'm sure you guys can get into much greater detail, it does seem like it exposes them legally to some kind of problems and understanding what their role was in all of this.
And I think the defense, Primo's lawyer kind of spoke out and spoke about why this, why comments were never made directly to Josh Primo, right? If it happens once, maybe you say something. If it happens twice, maybe you say something. So I think we're still, from a public standpoint, we're kind of unknown about how many time sessions it took before a complaint was made, if a complaint was ever made directly to Josh Primo. But yeah, I certainly think there's some questions left to be answered. But at the end of the day, right, if you're the Spurs and you're getting sued as part of this lawsuit and you've cut bait with the player, we've seen a number of players in other sports get sued for different things. The team doesn't cut bait. It never really can be used against you, right? Something you learn in law school called subsequent remedial measures. You really can't use the fact that you cut him as evidence that he did the thing. But in the court of public opinion, certainly doesn't look good. I think that's obvious at this point.
Yeah, and the Spurs are trying to, almost keep up their reputation in the court of public opinion. You saw Greg Popovich come out with a statement whenever his next press conference was after Hillary Cawthon's press conference, saying, we stand by everything that the Spurs have done, and this is the Spurs way, and we haven't, you guys know what we are, basically, like, we haven't deviated from this. So they are trying to win in the court of public opinion as well before this even gets to, if it ever gets to a jury or whatever the case may be.
Michael, I got one final question. I've been closely following your coverage when you were the reporter covering the New York Knicks for 2 years. And you've been watching very closely how Leon Rose has been carefully sort of building a program, cultivating or collecting assets first round draft choices, second round draft choices, incrementally trying to build a championship contender. But now, players like DeJounte Murray, Donovan Mitchell have slipped beyond the Knicks' grasp. So as a Knicks fan who's about to approach 50 years between NBA championships, it was May of 1973. We're about to go one half of a century. What do you think would be the next step for the New York Knicks? They've lost out on Murray and Mitchell and probably have some regrets about not pulling the trigger on either. Is there somebody out there that is plausibly within their reach, somebody who could be on the trading block within the next year, within the next 2 years, that could be a game changer to put the Knicks potentially on track to be a contender for a championship? Because right now, they're where they left off when Rose took over 3 years ago.
The decision to not trade for Donovan Mitchell, I thought was a wise one at the time, or at least I understood why they did it. I probably, all things considered, wouldn't have done it as well because I just didn't think Donovan Mitchell was that good and it would have made him that much better. I may have to maybe correct my assumptions about how good Donovan Mitchell is. He's been really, really good this year. The problem for the Knicks going forward is that whichever star they try to trade for in the future, they're going to have to expend just as many draft assets to do it, trade just as many good players. They're now reaching another crunch, which is guys like Obi Toppin, Emmanuel Quickley, Quentin Grimes in the years to come. All of these young, affordable players become less young and certainly much less affordable, right? So you're gonna have to decide whether to give them contracts, which makes them less desirable as trade assets. So they're reaching a point where they're gonna have some problems from that point as well, where they just won't have as many, avenues to acquire that next star player. And in terms of who's going to be out there next, look, it's really hard to predict because the NBA is just like a crapshoot. It seems like from time to time, you never know, like everything turns so quickly. But, let's talk about like the KD thing that we mentioned earlier. If he gets traded and the tectonic plates of the NBA shift again, you don't know who then wants to get traded after that. We saw Damian Lillard kind of flirt with the idea of wanting out. What happens in Minnesota, who's off to a kind of a rocky start? What happens with the Clippers with Paul George and Kawhi Leonard if they have another year where they don't win the championship? Are things finally settled with Zion Williamson in New Orleans? All these things happen that kind of change the league so quickly. So I don't know who it is. I just know that no matter what, based on the precedent just of this past summer alone, the Knicks are probably gonna have to pay more than they would have for Donovan Mitchell if they decided to make that trade. And they may not be in as good a place to do it based on their cap situation, based on the young players they have on the roster. The problem with not making your first round picks as they did this past year or trading them away as they will is you don't have as many good young players to trade either, right? That makes you less interesting for another team who's trying to trade their star. So this was kind of a moment that they didn't want to meet from that perspective. And I don't know for you as a Knicks fan who's had to deal with so many sad years, what the way out is just yet.
I'm not hopeful either because it all stems from ownership. The aura of James Dolan, hangs over the entire franchise, and the track record speaks for itself. So until there's a changing in the guard there, I'm not particularly optimistic that I'm going to experience another Knicks championship in my lifetime. So I'm going to have to go back to YouTube and watch Jerry Lucas, Bill Bradley, Dave DeBusschere, Earl Monroe, Walt Frazier, Willis Reed. I'll have to relive that glory year over and over because 50 years is just an insanely long period of time for a team in a major market when every other major city has experienced NBA championships during that lengthy time horizon.
Just whatever you do, don't sue the Knicks, at least so you can see the games in person. Otherwise, you'll just be stuck to YouTube and TV.
That's right. There'll be a ban on not only Wallach legal, but probably the entire conduct detrimental team. And I don't know if you're following the court, but James Dolan won round one of that decision with the law firm suing him over sort of the blanket ban of every lawyer in the firm potentially attending games at Madison Square Garden. So they won, or MSG won that on round one, and it's going to appeal right now before New York's appellate division first department. And that's probably your beat, Mike, to cover that case going forward.
Yeah, I think the hardest part of this job is basically triage and just understanding what to follow when, as we just spent like an hour talking about the different things going on in the NBA, some other, NIL stuff or college lawsuits. It's like, okay, what do I update Pacer on today? Like, where do I go? It's hard sometimes to figure it out.
Well, Mike, it was a pleasure having you. You've been very generous with your time. We covered the full gambit of sports, basketball, stories, We certainly appreciate it. Mike, tell everybody where they can find you on social and where they can find your work.
Not that I ever try to advise people to go on Twitter, but if you do, I'm at Mike Vorkunov over there. Read me at The Athletic. And guys, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I enjoy both the work that you guys do. And like I said, a 1/3 lawyer, I'm jealous of the legal knowledge that you dispense.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure. That was Mike Vorkunov of The Athletic. And that interview was sponsored by Themis Bar Review, the top bar prep company in the entire galaxy. Again, I'm not sure if you haven't done it yet, if you're thinking about what bar prep company to use, Themis Bar, the top bar prep company. If you sign up now, and again, anyone that's listening to this that is a law student is going to be signing up for some bar prep company. If you do it now, there is a massive discount. Dan, rumors are it might be like a $1,000 discount if you use our promo code conduct. And if it's not working for whatever reason, if you have questions, certainly reach out to me and I will put you in touch with the correct Themis people. Dan, I thought Mike was excellent. I thought, Dan, you didn't tell me he had 1 year of law school under his belt.
I didn't even know that. A lot of people have gone to law school that have made big names for themselves in other careers. Did you know that Bruce Springsteen's drummer, the mighty Max Weinberg, after Springsteen broke up the band in the late 80s, the mighty Max went to NYU Law School for 1 year and then dropped out to pursue, I guess his own band as Max Weinberg 7. He ended up working with Conan O'Brien. I think Mike will achieve similar career success if he hasn't already attained it, because he's one of the top NBA journalists, one of the best people covering the league for The Athletic. He covers the national, scope of the NBA as well as the business of the NBA, which is a pretty wide portfolio, as we're seeing here from this episode. So Mike is definitely one of the up and comers and influential journalists covering one of the most important pro sports leagues in the world.
Yeah, no, I thought Mike was excellent. And I think, Dan, we did a lot of basketball. I wanted to cover this story with you. So, the Colts story, which maybe a little bit of background, Brian Flores, for those coming new to our podcast, Brian Flores obviously is embroiled. He's now I think he's the assistant head coach, but for many years he was the Dolphins head coach, who obviously was with the Patriots for a period of time. He's currently suing a number of teams, including the Dolphins, the Giants, the Broncos, I believe the Texans as well, in addition to the NFL as a whole, for discriminatory practices in the hiring of head coaches and coordinators. So we spent a lot of time over the summer talking about how the coaching carousel worked itself out, maybe because of direct inference from Brian Flores. Now we have the firing from one of the more prestigious teams in the league. That's the Indianapolis Colts. I believe the fourth most winning franchise in the NFL in the last 22 years. They fire Frank Reich, head coach, who I think the Colts were the favorite to win the division at one point in time, and they fire him. So who do they bring in, Dan? They hire longtime center for Peyton Manning and those successful Colts teams, Jeff Saturday, who, Dan, as far as I know, I looked at a couple of NBA, NFL reporters were looking at it. I don't think there has ever been a coach in the history of the league that it doesn't have any coaching experience at the collegiate or NFL level. Saturday was, a pretty successful NFL player. I think he's in the Colts Hall of Fame. He coached at high school for a couple of years before, I think, moving over to ESPN. Somebody I saw today, I'm not sure if this is verified, but Jeff Saturday's high school team had like a combined record of like 21-16. So he wasn't even a successful high school coach. And for purposes of this story, I think very important, Jeff Saturday is white. He is obviously a player that had a lot of success with the Colts, but he has no coaching experience whatsoever. And Dan, the Rooney Rule here certainly comes into play, and there was a lot of questioning about whether the Rooney Rule applied to an interim head coach tag. I'll give you this, Dan, and I'll turn it over to you. From Tom Pelissero at the NFL Network, quote, regarding the Rooney Rule as it pertains to the Colts hiring Jeff Saturday, the rule does not apply to an interim head coach during the season. It does apply after the conclusion of the team's season. The club would have to fulfill the rule before hiring a full-time coach. So, Dan, I turn it to you. I gave you a lot. Thoughts on this hiring and maybe the impact on the Brian Flores case, the optics there?
Well, for me, the optics relate back to Dan Snyder. A week or 2 weeks ago, Jim Irsay was sort of the hero of the NFL ownership community. He took on Dan Snyder and begun to rehabilitate his own reputation. Remember, he's had somewhat of a checkered past, not only as an owner, but with some off the field. He wasn't a player, but he had issues with discipline from the league. And in one fell swoop, he became the voice of reason. And in less than 10 days, he squandered it all away by hiring somebody not only with no NFL coaching experience on the head coaching or on the assistant level, but not even any collegiate coaching experience. He coached at a small prep school in Georgia that had less than 2,000 students. And what this says I think by and large, isn't that the Rooney Rule is meaningless, because I understand in the ebb and flow of a season when you have to make a quick change, you don't have time or the luxury of interviewing multiple candidates. You've got to make a change on a dime because you got a game this upcoming Sunday. But what does it say about his belief? What does it say about Irsay's belief in the current coaching staff? Most coaching staffs are comprised of close to 20 coaches, coordinators, position coaches, assistant position coaches. You had a talent pool of close to 20 coaches that were probably qualified minority candidates on those coaching staff. So not only are you thumbing your nose and disregarding the talents and capabilities of the existing coaching staff, but you're basically sending an implied message to the other 31 teams that none of them are worth hiring as a head coach. It is a tone-deaf decision that undermines the voice of reason that he projected during the Dan Snyder episode and has essentially created the team's 2022 NFL season while sending the wrong message, a mixed message about the qualifications of the remaining coaches that comprise the coaching staff.
If I was a coach, either, black, white, no matter what type of race I was, and someone was getting hired over me that had no prior experience whatsoever, and maybe their only qualification is that they were friends with the owner, I'd be pretty upset. And that speaks to really any level of employment. You'd think in an ideal world, right, that the most qualified person is hired for those positions. But, unfortunately, they're not. And sometimes, Dan, I've talked about it on career panels. Sometimes it helps, who right, for a particular job. It helps to network and whatnot. But I think with the optics of what's going on in the NFL, I think Irsay, who was just, as you pointed out, Dan, like the hero in some circles for speaking out against Dan Snyder, loses all of that goodwill in an instant by, in the middle of a lawsuit with Brian Flores, by doing that. So whatever favors I think he might have earned from the NFL owners by speaking out against Dan Snyder, I think he loses some of them by making this kind of crazy hire in the middle of this other litigation. So yeah, it's a private organization. It's a private team. Jim Irsay can do what he wants. He can hire who he wants. The optics, I think, are really poor.
Yeah, I can understand if the team was winless or one win and they're trying to tank to get the number one overall draft choice. But Dan, their record is 3-5-1. They're only 2 games off the lead in the AFC South, trailing the Tennessee Titans. They're still in a race. Yet a decision like this almost assures a complete breakdown in communication between coaching staff, and players. And until today, in the world of sports law, Jeff Saturday was known most for being the petitioner in the famous city of Pittsburgh jock tax case, in which a court ruling declared that visiting players should not have the taxes deducted by the city of Pittsburgh. I mean, we did an episode on this with Robert Raiola. So Jeff Saturday has been a champion for players. And I think in this instance, he probably should have passed on the opportunity, because he's obviously an interim coach, not meaningfully going to be a candidate for any other position for any of the other 31 NFL teams. And what this does is it compromises the Colts' remainder of the season. They were in the midst of a race. They may have been disappointing, but they won 3 games. There's still a half a season remaining. And this is a puzzling, clueless decision by an owner who is essentially giving away all the goodwill that he established in the world of football and among fans the country over, especially in Washington, D.C., Maryland, and Virginia, who saluted Jim Irsay for the stance that he took against Dan Snyder less than 2 weeks ago. And in less than 2 weeks' time, he's frittered it all away with a illogical, puzzling decision, the likes of which I don't think we've ever seen in choosing an interim coach in the middle of a season. Who has ever hired somebody who's never had the job on a collegiate or a head coaching level mid-season? It's absolutely stunning.
I don't even think you put the qualifier mid-season. My understanding is that it's never happened, ever. That someone just went from out of nowhere. But then who else didn't expect it? Jeff Saturday, who said, quote, "I was shocked." So
he should have turned down the job. And if he had been a loyal alumnus of the Indianapolis Colts, he should have said, Mr. Irsay, you should be hiring somebody on the existing staff, because what you're doing by hiring me is you're telling the staff that none of you are good enough to be the head coach of the Indianapolis Colts. And it really sends a mixed message to people who've worked hard all year, preseason, past seasons. I mean, it really shows a disconnect between ownership and the coaching staff.
Which sends a bad message. And Dan, I'm going to there's not really much more in this. But Reggie Wayne, who was on those Peyton Manning teams, right? He's the wide receivers coach. So I don't know. It's a normal person. Maybe you have a conversation with, right? You could go through any. There's other previous, there's coaches on that staff with previous head coaching experience. So again, it's not necessarily a black and white issue, but the optics, I just think, in the middle of this litigation are really, really poor. But anyway, Dan, anything else to add on this particular topic or the basketball stuff before we end our conversation?
No, I think we're good to transition to the closing of Conduct Detrimental. It was a great episode. So I think we covered all the topics that we need to cover for this week.
Okay, Dan. Thanks as always to Mike Lawson and Justin Mader for putting the episode together. On behalf of Dan, myself, and all of us here at Conduct Detrimental, we will see you next time on another episode of Conduct Detrimental.